What if blame is actually fear disguised as self-protection? Most people think blame is about responsibility. I think blame is often about protection. When someone blames another person, we usually assume that they are trying to avoid accountability. And sometimes that's true. But I think there is often something happening deeper underneath. I think many people blame because they are afraid. Not afraid of the mistake itself, but afraid of what the mistake means. In my previous video, I discussed about how many of us grow up associating mistake with our worth. We unconsciously learn, if I make a mistake, there must be something wrong with me. If I fail, I'm a failure. If I get something wrong, I am less valuable. And if that's the belief we carry, then admitting mistakes becomes emotionally dangerous. Because now admitting a mistake isn't simply, I forgot, I misunderstood, I got it wrong. Instead, it feels like admitting, I am stupid, I'm incomplete, I am unworthy. And that is a much heavier burden to carry. And I think this is why many people struggle to admit making mistakes. Not because they hate truth, not because they're bad people, but because they cannot tolerate what mistakes say about them. Imagine two people making the same mistake. The first person thinks, I made a mistake. The second person thinks, I am a mistake. Which person do you think will find it easier to take responsibility? Of course, it's the first person. Because for them, the mistake is simply an event. But for the second person, a mistake feels like an attack on their identity. And when our identity is threatened, we become defensive. We justify, we deny, we explain, we minimize, we blame. Not because we're dishonest, but because we are trying to protect ourselves from shame. And I think that's why many people misunderstand blame. We often think blame is the opposite of responsibility. But I think blame is actually the opposite of self-compassion. The less compassion we have for ourselves, the more terrifying it becomes to be wrong. And the more terrifying it is to be wrong, the more we try to look for someone else to take the blame. Think about a child who grows up in a house where mistakes are met with criticism, anger, punishment, humiliation, and ridicule. The child learns something very important, that mistakes means danger, being wrong is dangerous, admitting fault is dangerous. The consequence is not simply the mistake itself. The consequence becomes emotional pain. So the child adapts. The child learns how to avoid that pain. Perhaps they become defensive. Perhaps they lie. Perhaps they become perfectionistic. Perhaps they become people pleasers. Each of these behaviors is different on the surface, but underneath, they're often trying to solve the same problem, avoiding shame. And this is why I think blaming is often misunderstood. Many people see blaming and assume that person doesn't care. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the person cares so much that they cannot bear the possibility of being wrong. Their self-worth is hanging in the balance. And because they believe mistakes reduce their worth, they fight desperately to avoid responsibility. Now, this does not mean we excuse blame. Understanding something isn't the same as excusing it. If we blame others unfairly, we can still create harm. If we refuse accountability, relationships suffer. Trust erodes, growth stops. So the goal is to not justify blame, but to understand it. Because when we understand something, we can change it. I think one of the most powerful questions we can ask ourselves when we become defensive is, what am I protecting right now? Am I protecting truth? Or am I protecting ego? Am I protecting reality? Or am I protecting my self-image? Am I afraid of the mistake? Or Am I afraid of what the mistake say about me? That question alone can reveal so much, because often the thing we're protecting isn't our integrity, it's our identity. And once we see that, something begins to change. We begin to separate our worth from our mistakes. We begin understanding that being wrong does not make us worthless. We begin realizing that accountability is not an attack. It is information. It is feedback. It is opportunity to learn. And something remarkable happens when mistakes stop threatening our identity. Blame starts to lose its purpose. The need to defend ourselves begins to soften. The need to justify ourselves begins to soften. The need to explain ourselves begins to soften, because we no longer need to prove our worth. Our worth was never on trial. And when our worth is no longer on trial, taking responsibility becomes that much easier. We can say, "You're right. I made a mistake. I didn't handle that well. I can see how I hurt you. I'll do better next time." Not because we enjoy being wrong, but because being wrong no longer feels like the end of the world. In fact, truly strong people are not people who never make mistakes. They are people who can admit mistakes without losing themselves. People who can hear feedback without collapsing. People who can take responsibility without drowning in shame. Because they understand something important. A mistake is something you did, not who you are. And when you truly understand that, blame slowly becomes unnecessary. So this is the second video of the 4-part series, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed creating it. And I would love to know what resonated with you in this video. If you write it in the comment, I would love to read about it. I can't wait to share the next idea with you, and I shall see you very, very soon.